Good morning, everyone. Today is August 8th, 2026, and what the United States military has just pulled off in the Strait of Hormuz is something Iran genuinely believed America could never do. Not for lack of firepower, but because Tehran didn't think Washington had the staying power, the reach, or the sustained focus to see it through. Closing the Strait of Hormuz wasn't just another card in Iran's deck. It was the centerpiece of 40 years of strategic leverage, arguably the single most powerful economic lever on the planet. 20% of the world's daily oil supply, 20% of global liquefied natural gas, 13 million barrels of crude every single day, funneled through a corridor barely 21 miles wide. A corridor Tehran believed it could open or slam shut whenever it served the regime. That single choke point was the foundation the IRGC built its entire deterrence doctrine on. And here's what you need to understand today. The United States military just tore that foundation apart. Not gradually, not partially, comprehensively. The mine threat neutralized. The surface fleet meant to enforce. The closure destroyed. The fast attack boat swarms hunted down and sunk. The anti-ship missile batteries guarding the strait hit with 5,000-pound bunker busters. And then, finally, the ship started moving again. 900 commercial vessels carrying 450 million barrels of crude escorted straight through a waterway. The IRGC had sworn would never reopen without Iran's permission. This isn't a partial win with an asterisk. It's one of the most complete dismantlings of a maritime choke point strategy in modern naval history. Like this video and subscribe, because today we're breaking down exactly how the US dismantled Iran's blockade, layer by layer, and why the implications reach far beyond this single conflict. Rewind to March 2nd, 2026. 3 days after Operation Epic Fury launched what became the largest American air campaign since the Iraq War. Sealing off the strait wasn't panic. It was the activation of a plan rehearsed and positioned for decades. The moment the US and Israel struck on February 28th, IRGC naval commanders executed a playbook they'd been sitting on since the early 2000s. Mines went into the shipping lanes, fast attack boats moved into harassment positions, radar installations across the strait lit up to track every vessel, anti-ship missile batteries along the coast and island chain went to elevated readiness, and the IRGC's self-declared Persian Gulf. Strait Authority, Zero, standing under international law, plenty of firepower behind it, began warning commercial vessels the strait was no longer safe. Within days, the world's biggest shipping companies, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and dozens more, suspended their Hormuz transits entirely. By March 10th, roughly 1,000 vessels carrying 20,000 seafarers sat stranded outside the strait. Traffic through the world's most important energy corridor collapsed by 90%. The IEA called it the most severe energy security crisis on record. The economic fallout wasn't theoretical. Brent crude, sitting at $70 a barrel on February 27th, averaged over $100 through March and spiked as high as $126 at the worst point. Capital Economics projected that a sustained climb to $100 a barrel alone would add nearly a full percentage point onto global inflation. Arriving right, as economies were already emerging from nearly 5 straight years of above-target inflation, with almost no buffer left to absorb another shock. Shipping companies that rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope added 10 to 14 days to every delivery, and freight and insurance costs climbed high enough to make many routes financially pointless. War risk insurance on any vessel attempting the Gulf became so expensive in the opening weeks that it functioned as a second blockade layer on its own. The IRGC didn't need a boat in the water to stop a ship. The insurance market did the job. For them. Egypt's Suez Canal, which relies heavily on Indian Ocean traffic normally flowing through Hormuz, saw revenue fall roughly 60% as the rerouting rippled outward. India, Japan, South Korea, and China had no real alternative route. They began burning through strategic reserves and paying escalating spot prices. The IEA's emergency drawdown mechanisms kicked in, but could only stretch supply for about 26 days. After that, shortage economics took over completely. In the US, gasoline prices climbed, and inflation the Fed had fought for years to tame crept back up. From the IRGC's perspective, everything was unfolding according to plan. Global pain building toward political pressure on Washington to negotiate on Iran's terms. What Tehran didn't account for was that Washington was working from an entirely different theory of how this would end, a systematic campaign that dismantled the blockade's architecture one layer at a time until nothing was left holding it up. The first target was the mine threat, the most dangerous and psychologically potent piece of Iran's closure strategy. A mine doesn't need to sink anything to shut down a waterway. The mere credible possibility is enough to make insurers pull coverage, which makes shipping companies pull their vessels, which closes the lane as effectively as a physical blockade would. Iran understood this. The mine-laying operations that began in early March weren't designed to create an impenetrable field. They were designed to trigger an insurance panic so severe that no captain would accept the liability. A handful of strategically placed mines, amplified by media coverage, achieved what would otherwise have required hundreds. It's a cheap weapon, used with real sophistication, and the IRGC had been stockpiling mines and training crews for exactly this scenario. Trump's response came March 10th, and it left no ambiguity. He posted on Truth Social that any vessel caught mining the strait would be dealt with quickly and violently. That wasn't just rhetoric. CENTCOM released footage the same day showing 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels destroyed in a single strike. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, later confirmed the total number of mine-laying platforms destroyed across the campaign reached 44. That didn't clear mines already in the water, but it crippled Iran's ability to keep seeding new ones under active surveillance. Here's the complication almost nobody discussed before the war: the Navy's own mine countermeasures gap. In the months prior, the Navy had decommissioned 4 Avenger-class minesweepers, and 2 of the 3 remaining mine clearance ships in theater happened to be in Singapore for maintenance when Iran started mining the strait. The exact capability the U.S. needed most had just been stripped away right before it mattered most. That gap forced improvisation, guided missile destroyers repurposed as mine countermeasures platforms, paired with underwater drones, and MH-53 Sea Dragon helicopters standing in for the dedicated minesweepers that should have been there. Admiral Brad Cooper announced that a safe transit corridor was being established for the maritime industry. Clearing mines is slow and dangerous. It didn't happen overnight. But destroying the mine-laying vessels before they finished seeding the lanes, combined with a sustained clearance effort, stripped away the first and most psychologically powerful layer of Iran's strategy. While the clearance operation ran, the U.S. was simultaneously running its own blockade against Iran. This is the part of the story that fundamentally changed the economic calculus of the entire conflict. The naval blockade the U.S. imposed on Iranian ports on April 13th, after the Islamabad ceasefire talks collapsed, wasn't symbolic. It was a direct hit on the one revenue stream keeping the IRGC financially afloat. Before the war, Iran had been generating substantial oil revenue through a shadow fleet of tankers quietly moving cargo to Chinese refineries in defiance of sanctions. That money funded the missile program, the drone factories, the fast boat fleets, and the regional proxy network. The American blockade, enforced by more than 15 warships and over 10,000 sailors and Marines, began intercepting vessels moving in and out of Iranian ports. 3 ships were seized outright, 85 more turned back. U.S. government estimates put the cost to Iran at roughly $500 million a day. That number matters because of the twist underneath it. When the war began, $100 oil was actually a windfall for Iran. Every smuggled barrel earned $30 more than it would have before the conflict. The blockade hit that windfall directly, choking off the exports, funding the very operations keeping the strait closed. Iran wanted to starve the world of oil. Washington was simultaneously starving Iran of the money paying for the war. That reversal is the piece Iranian planning never modeled. The Islamabad framework eventually signed in June 2026 was, at its core, Tehran acknowledging that the counter-blockade was inflicting more damage than anticipated. A regime expecting to cash in on the price spike instead watched its revenue intercepted while its infrastructure absorbed nightly airstrikes. The mine clearance and counter-blockade were the setup. The knockout blow, what actually broke the blockade rather than just weakening the systems enforcing it, was Project Freedom. Trump announced it on a Sunday. The U.S. would begin escorting ships through Hormuz the next morning, and any Iranian interference would meet overwhelming force. Admiral Brad Cooper laid out the package: guided missile destroyers, more than 100 aircraft, unmanned systems, and roughly 15,000 service members. This maritime freedom framework. The broader diplomatic and operational structure. Secretary Rubio had circulated to U.S. diplomatic posts in late April, paired a Washington-based coordination hub with the military muscle of Project Freedom at sea. It wasn't purely military. It was a combined military, diplomatic, and commercial effort designed to convince ship owners and insurers that American protection was reliable enough to bet their vessels on. And that confidence needed the first real test to succeed. It did. When the IRGC threw its full multi-domain response at the first convoy on May 4th, Aegis combat systems shot down every incoming threat. Apache helicopters sank 6 fast attack boats, and not a single escorted ship was hit. CENTCOM published the footage publicly, and every shipping executive watching ran the same calculation. The risk under escort was manageable. Bookings started flowing in. A-10 Warthogs sweeping the coastal approaches added another layer of protection, while F-35s flying ISR above the convoy corridors ensured nothing could approach without CENTCOM knowing well before it got close. Every piece of Iran's interdiction capability was either neutralized in advance or destroyed the moment it engaged. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Since early May, CENTCOM has facilitated the transit of 900 commercial vessels carrying 450 million barrels of crude. Through a waterway, the IRGC swore was permanently sealed without Iranian permission. Traffic hasn't returned to the pre-war average of 138 vessels a day. Insurance premiums remain elevated, and some operators still choose the longer Cape route. But the central question, could Iran stop American escorted traffic through the strait, has been answered. It couldn't. 900 ships proved it. Here's the full picture because it matters. Breaking the blockade doesn't mean the strait is back to normal. It isn't. The mine threat is severely degraded, not eliminated. Iran can still deploy mines using small boats or drones, so the countermeasures effort continues as long as the IRGC keeps any credible presence in the Gulf. The mine countermeasures gap exposed in March hasn't been fully closed. By improvised destroyer and drone operations, and Navy leadership will be answering for those pre-war decommissioning decisions for years. Iran also still holds an unknown number of anti-ship cruise missiles buried in coastal positions that weren't all struck. The fast attack fleet took a massive hit, more than 60 boats destroyed in the July 7th wave alone, but the inventory was extensive and not all of it is gone. And the psychological weight of the mine threat, even the mere suggestion that new ones might be out there, keeps insurance markets jumpy in a way 900 successful transits doesn't erase overnight. War risk premiums remain above pre-war levels, and some shipping firms still avoid the strait even with escort available. The June ceasefire nominally committed Iran to stop targeting commercial vessels, and Iran broke it within weeks, triggering the July 7th response that destroyed 60 boats and 80 ground targets. Ceasefire, violation, strike, renewed talks. That cycle has repeated throughout this conflict with no sign of settling permanently. What America has achieved is a decisive shift in who controls the strait, from Iran to the United States. That's not the same as restoring the open commons that existed before February 28th. What exists now is a militarized corridor under American protection, different from both the pre-war status quo and the Iranian-controlled choke point the IRGC tried to build. The economic dimension of the reopening deserves more attention than it's gotten. As the 900 ship figure climbed, Brent crude retreated from its peak, above $126, back into the 80 to 90 range, as insurers priced in the reduced risk. That decline benefited every oil importing economy on the planet, including American consumers whose gasoline prices, one of the most politically sensitive metrics of the entire conflict, began falling again. That fed a loop that worked in Washington's favor, reinforcing the administration's willingness to keep pushing rather than settle for a worse deal. It also cut into the windfall Russia had been collecting, reportedly an extra $150 million a day, from elevated prices during the closure. Every barrel moving through the reopened strait and pulling prices down was simultaneously shrinking that windfall. Russia's ability to fund its war in Ukraine is directly tied to global oil prices, and an $85 market is a materially worse environment for the Kremlin's war budget than a $120 one. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which had partially rerouted exports through overland pipelines, can now move full volumes by sea again. The Saudi pipeline to the Red Sea had been running at capacity during the worst weeks. Reopened transit lets Aramco return to its preferred maritime route. For Qatar, whose LNG exports have no viable alternative route, reopening wasn't a preference. It was existential. Qatar's contracts with buyers in Japan, South Korea, Europe, and India include force majeure clauses that don't hold indefinitely without renegotiation on worse terms. Beyond this single conflict, what this demonstrates matters enormously. Whether a maritime choke point can still work as coercive leverage against American power. That theory, that closing a critical waterway generates enough global pain to constrain U.S. military action, has been central to Iranian planning for decades, and it's been studied closely by China around Taiwan and by Russia in the Baltic and Black Sea. What played out in Hormuz between February and August 2026 is the most complete real-world test of that theory against sustained American counterpressure. The result, a 5-month record showing the U.S. could fight all three pillars simultaneously: military denial, economic coercion, political pressure, while absorbing the fallout through counter-blockade, diplomacy, and forced transit under escort. The military pillar was dismantled component by component. 44 mine layers destroyed, 17 surface vessels eliminated in the opening days of epic fury alone, more than 60 fast attack boats destroyed in the July 7th wave, anti-ship missile sites hit with bunker busters, and even hardened island facilities struck in daylight raids. What often gets missed is that this pillar wasn't just hardware, it was human expertise. The submarine crews, the boat commanders who knew the shoals and currents, the radar operators, the missile crews who understood the terrain masking needed to launch undetected. That knowledge degrades under sustained combat pressure just like equipment does. You can build a new fast boat quickly. You cannot quickly replace a 3-year veteran crew. The economic coercion pillar collapsed once Project Freedom made transit viable again. CENTCOM's perfect interception record proved the risk was manageable, and 900 transits gave the industry empirical proof. The political pillar broke because the counter-blockade flipped the equation, costing Iran roughly $500 million a day instead of letting it profit from the spike. Congress authorized $95 billion for the campaign, and the Hamas. Senate killed the war powers resolution that would have ended U.S. involvement. Iran's bet that American political will would crack lasted exactly as long as it took Washington to start moving ships and prove the mission was achievable without unacceptable losses. That's a data set every rival power with choke point ambitions has to reckon with, especially Chinese planners running Taiwan, scenarios built on the same theory. So let me know in the comments. Does the U.S. keep a permanent escort presence in the Gulf after this war ends, essentially running the strait as an American-administered corridor, the way Trump floated when he mentioned collecting a toll? Does Iran rebuild its maritime capability once the pressure eases? And does the shipping industry ever go back to treating Hormuz as routine rather than a corridor where every premium reflects the IRGC's lingering shadow capability? Those questions don't have clean answers yet, but one does. Did the U.S. have the capability, the will, and the structure to break a blockade Iran spent decades building? That got answered between February and August 2026. Not through a press release, but through 900 ship transits and 450 million barrels of crude moving through the world's most important waterway on American terms. If this gave you the full picture of how the U.S. broke Iran's blockade, from the mines to the restored flow of oil, hit like and send it to someone who needs to understand what happened in the Strait of Hormuz these past 5 months. Subscribe. This conflict is still moving, and whatever comes next will be shaped by what's just been established in that 21-mile corridor. Iran spent 4 decades building the most powerful maritime weapon of the modern era. The United States military just took it apart.